Welcome everyone to our Spring 2022 series of OTF Connects webinars entitled Supporting Teacher Efficacy and Student Engagement. My name is Peter Beans and I'm honored to be your moderator for today's session with Chelsea Atwell and Neil Anderson, amongst others, entitled Media Literacy and Serious Fun in the K-12 Classroom. Before we begin, I'd like to do a land acknowledgement. We acknowledge we are gathered in the traditional territories of various Indigenous peoples, and we further recognize our duty to support the achievement of the calls to actions stemming from the recommendations of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada. Please allow me to welcome our primary presenters, Chelsea Atwell and Neil Anderson. Chelsea is the co-vice president of the Association for Media Literacy in Ontario, a subject association that supports media education in Canada and internationally. She has worked with children and youth for over 20 years. Currently, she is a kindergarten educator with the TDSB, where she regularly embeds media literacy into her classroom practice to provide engaging and playful inquiry for her students. Neil is the president of the Association for Media Literacy. He has taught primary to post-secondary media studies for over 30 years, including media studies AQ courses. He has delivered keynotes and workshops across Canada, in the United States, and many other jurisdictions. Neil's writing includes Media Literacy's Gift to Literature Study and English Teaching, Practice and Critique, co-authored Why Social Media Literacy in Forum magazine, Media Literacy Education Ontario in Media Literacy in Action, and How Might Context Influence Media Literacy Education in Multidisciplinary Approaches to Media Literacy. His awards include the Jesse McCann's Award and the Magic Lantern Award. You can follow Neil on Twitter at MediaC, that's Media SEE. So now let's turn it over to Chelsea and Neil. Welcome. And with that, I will stop sharing.
Okay, thanks, Neil. You can see everything, looks good. So thank you once again for being here. We have a very skilled group of Association for Media Literacy executive members here this afternoon to address media literacy in the K-12 classroom. A really big thank you to Irene, Diana, Nina, and Michelle, who are all AML executive members with a really rich wealth of experience to talk about the important role that media literacy has in learning. And just a quick note, as Peter indicated, Michelle will be our chat moderator. So if you have any questions, you can pop them in the chat. And Michelle will also be sharing some resources as well in the chat. And if you're looking for a copy of our slide deck, we will give you our website address, which we will post the slides in a few weeks on the website. So you'll be able to access it there. All right, I'll turn it over. Oh, I'm going to do one more piece here, and then we're going to turn over to Neil. So just for this afternoon's conversation, we wanted to establish the 4 agreements for courageous conversations from Glenn E. Singleton. So we ask that you stay engaged, experience discomfort, speak your truth, and finally expect and accept non-closure. Now I'm going to turn it over to Neil.
Thank you. We're going to talk about the media literacy triangle pretty consistently through this presentation. It was innovated by the Scottish Film Council and given to the Association for Media Literacy. It's an heuristic or a series of qualities in media experiences. One of my friends calls it a decoder, which is fun to think about. It's as though there are secrets to be uncovered. One of the best features of the triangle is that it explores media experiences from 3 different points of view. So the triangle's hidden message is that we can look at things from different perspectives, and that has become very important in the 21st century. One of the sides of the triangle is called text. Text can be interpreted in several ways, so it's important for us to establish its meaning. These are the official Ministry of Education definitions: elementary and secondary. For us at the Association for Media Literacy, text refers to any media experience, including clothing and architecture. The qualities of the text side of the triangle describe characteristics of a media experience. Denotation refers to the generally accepted or official meaning of the media experience. Connotation refers to the popular usage or street meaning of the experience. This can be much more interesting because it is culturally inflected. Each media experience uses codes to contain and communicate its ideas. For example, graphic novels and picture books use codes of narrative, graphic design, and written words. Media experiences also communicate values. These might be communicated directly or communicated by what is missing from the experience. Texts also express information via a genre, which might be a Western or a whodunit if it's a movie, or a short narrative if it's a TikTok video. Texts are often commodities, meaning that they can be bought and sold. Even those media experiences which we don't buy or sell, like our social media posts, are commodities because they are sold by social media companies. So commodities is a very useful term. When one media experience contains or references other media experiences, we call that intertextuality. This can be really fun study because students can research and explain how texts that sample other texts become sophisticated messages. The audience side of the triangle contains characteristics of audiences. Race is an especially significant audience characteristic because of the Black Lives Matter and Every Child Matters protests. Class, which some people think doesn't exist in North America, is also an interesting media literacy phenomenon. Is class determined by the size of our houses, the way we talk, or how kind we are? Culture, especially in multicultural Canada, is a very fertile and compelling audience characteristic because our cultures impact our understandings of our media experiences. Gender is especially exciting right now because we are currently, as I speak, changing our uses of pronouns from he or she to they. And so gender is very useful. An audience's textual competence or ability to make meaning from media experiences is very important right now. It refers directly to our media literacy proficiency, which will determine how well we can navigate and use our mediated environments. And so that textual competence is exactly what we'll be talking about for this whole workshop. Media experiences can also impact our psychology, making us feel sad, happy, optimistic, and more. People use their media experiences for different social functions. Sometimes we watch or listen to enjoy, but other times just to be part of a group. Sometimes we create and post in hopes of leading a group. The production side of the triangle also has specific characteristics. Distribution of media experiences is now something anybody online can do. But which distribution channels we choose can become a significant factor. With the ease of copying and redistributing existing media experiences, legalities, especially regarding copyright, are important. So is the ability to libel other people. Those of us who post to more than one social media platform are well aware of codes and practices, and that we have to produce media messages that suit those. Ownership can refer to who owns a particular platform, but it can also involve who owns our data and what they can do with it. TikTok is owned by a Chinese company. Should I be concerned about where my data is stored? Is someone selling my data? To whom? For what purposes? Now that we have seen people banned from social media platforms or programming blocked, Control is an important aspect of media literacy learning. And it's not government effects, it's private company effects. Each platform has a business plan and has to please its shareholders, even if it sometimes means something unethical. Are you Android or iOS? Do you have the latest version of the app? Do you have enough bandwidth? Did you use the right password? Hey, you're on mute. These are all technological issues that we need to understand and appreciate because they impact the media environment and therefore our learning and teaching. These are many complex ideas. In order to make them more accessible in classrooms, the Association for Media Literacy has operationalized them as questions. These are some of the production questions that you can use with students. These are some of the audience questions. These are some of the text questions. The Media Literacy Triangle is a useful pedagogical tool downloadable from aml.ca that you will hear more about in the rest of this presentation. And now, here's Chelsea.
Thanks, Neil. Okay, so in this activity, I wanted to discuss reading a virtual space. And this is is an example of something I would do with early years learners. And although this experience is completely scalable for learners above that early years range, it can be applied to various media forms and experiences. Reading a virtual space allows educators to teach through various media, but also uses these as opportunities to teach about media. And I'll have Dana advance the next slide, please. Thanks. So through analysis, educators can work to deepen their understanding of the way subject content is embedded in media literacy. For example, information about this is available in the Guide to Effective Instruction in Media Literacy, grades 4 to 6, volume 7. In this example, I'm showing a website that we might use in our classroom. That was on the previous slide, the National Geographic site for kids. And, we would consult this site as a group to have a look at find information about our various inquiries. So the before, during, and after structure that educators use when reading is also helpful when we think about reading a media environment such as a website. It allows educators to activate prior knowledge, check for understanding during the lesson, and then finally consolidate the student learning. And I'll ask, and I do have some resources that Michelle will pop in the chat in a moment. So in this presentation, I've included a copy of the Media Literacy Triangle available from aml.ca. That's what Neil just went over with you, which through the key concepts activates student thinking and reflection to allow them to begin to think critically and to analyze and interpret information. And for the purpose of this discussion, I've also included the early years media literacy triangle, which has prompts that can further support student thinking when examining a variety of media. And I'll have Dana go to the next slide. Thank you. As demonstrated through the use of the media triangle and key concepts, it both provides prompts for educators that they can use to leverage these questions for rich discussions. Educators can teach through the media literacy key concepts, but also teach about the media experience students are analyzing. This year, our kindergarten class community engaged in an inquiry about masks, as the children were asking many questions about why we're wearing them, why are other people wearing them, sharing their experiences, and really reflecting on how those masks make us feel. And in this presentation, I have included a link to some helpful resources for asking focused viewing questions with all media triangles available from aml.ca. I'll have Diana go to the next slide. Thank you. And then these are some of the resources that we use to support our inquiry around that. We started by asking the children inquiry questions about what they already know about masks and what do we wonder. The children shared various responses, which you see on the chart paper on the right-hand side. And we also use posters from the City of Toronto to examine why people wear masks to be safe. As well, we looked at a video from TVO Kids that helped us further our learning about that. And we use the posters available from the City of Toronto to explore accurate information. We also viewed a series of videos, like I said, from TVO Kids about wearing masks, which talked about accurate versus inaccurate information. The key concepts provided us a useful framework to ground the analysis of the posters, and questions and prompts such as what kind of media form is this? What do you notice about this media form? What messages are represented? Were all evident. And in the discussion, the children were aware of the value messages when wearing masks, and to keep them, such as to keep them safe, to keep them healthy, as well as starting with what the children already know illustrates how they negotiate their understanding from these experiences. And then Diana's showing us some really fun, playful experiences, because play is really essential in any early years program, because that's how children make meaning. And play is essential as well because it's also production. And having the children explore and design their own masks was inspired by a lesson from one of our other presenters on tonight, Irene. We also did a self-portrait. So every month in our classroom, we draw a picture of ourselves. And so for this month, we had photos of the children, and then they designed a really fun mask to put over top. And this experience allowed for playful production using a variety of open-ended materials. All right, and I think from here, and I have one more resource just to talk about. So we talked a little bit about finding information and looking at different sources. So the book on the right-hand side called On the News is definitely a great text that it's, I guess it's nonfiction, and I'd recommend using it with young children because it just talks about different ways information in the news media is presented, and it does that in a really accessible way. And then I think Diana just wanted to talk about the resource that she recommended there.
Which is a book called Something Happened in Our Town, a child's story about racial injustice. The link below the slide also provides some guidance about how to talk about it in age-appropriate ways with the students. So we don't want to pretend like it's not happening, but if we address these issues in sensitive ways, in ways that don't do judgment, we can get so much out of it with our students. So thanks, Chelsea. My name is Diana Malashevsky. My pronouns are she and her, and I'm just going to talk about a couple of really fun things that you can do with your students, because the title of our talk today is about the serious fun of media literacy. And when they are involved in the content creation, the fun really happens. This example comes from a task that I have been collaborating with the French teacher with their grade 7 and 8 students. And they're creating a French fake news report about a Francophone community. And as the points here on the slide say, when you create media texts, you gain understanding into how they're made. You understand where the sausage comes from. And you discover the techniques that are used to encourage readers or listeners or viewers to believe what you're saying. During this talk, we also had several discussions with the students about bias and racial presumptions and stereotypes, because this was about Francophone communities around the world. And it was a very productive kind of conversation. They had fun, though. It was enjoyable for them to create these very outrageously fake news projects. This one is about a country that made a really big house out of chocolate. Another example, which takes a lot less time to create, but is equally as enjoyable and fun, is an activity called Two Facts and a Fiction. And I'm going to rely on our wonderful moderator, Michelle Solomon here, to help us out with this. So we've created 3 pieces of information in the gray box, and we'd like you to actually guess which one is the fake? Which one is the fictional piece of information? This task, sometimes called Two Truths and a Lie, it's a get to know you activity, but can also be used for various curriculum connections as well too. So let's try it out. Number 1, AML was founded in 1988. Number 2, AML helped write the Ontario language curriculum in 2006. And number 3, AML has had 4 presidents. Can you type in the chat? Which one do you think is the fake? I'll touch base with Michelle in just a minute, but I just wanted to make sure that you increase the impact of an activity like this by analyzing the techniques that make the misinformation sound plausible, credible, believable, and take a look at some of those synonyms, the thesaurus there at the bottom, because you want to make sure that you choose the words and the vocabulary that will help your students most understand. And you can connect those techniques used by them to those used by others and how they play on our pre-existing biases. So Michelle, can I turn to you? What's this consensus? Which one is the lie?
It to be number 3. Most people believe it's number 3.
Fascinating. And the actual answer is number 1. AML was not founded in 1988. It was actually founded in 1978. And so if we had more time, we would talk about, well, why did you think number 3 was the fake? Why were you convinced that number 1 was true? And these kind of discussions really help. So have fun with your media. Here's some more fun things that you can do with media in your classroom.
Thanks, Diana. I'm Nina Silver, and I'm a retired secondary school teacher who taught media studies for quite a long time. And I wanted to provide some frameworks and jumping off points from which you can get high school students to think about how they're receiving information about current events. So first off, although social media sites are often the places that break news to many of us, social media sites were not actually designed or intended to provide news. They were intended to be social platforms. But we also need to think about the fact that news can also mean different things to different audiences. For example, to a kindergarten student who's just got a new puppy, that's news. And seeing journalists reporting weather along with their pets can immediately influence their trust in their broadcasters or their media influencers that they may be witness to at an early age. For a high school student, news about current fashion trends, music, or posts from social influencers about what is cool and what is not will strongly influence them in beliefs about the world around them. So we need to consider where we are getting our information from. Diana? Every source of information has its own limitations. So this is a useful framework that you can actually bring into the classroom and it can be a good jumping off point. And I'd like to go through the framework here and talk a little bit about the limitations of the various places we get our information. So starting off with Facebook, we need to realize that if we get information from Facebook, there are certain limitations to that. The articles posted are usually by friends who think like you do. Users rarely check alternative sources before clicking on that share button. And one more recent issue that's come to be addressed is this concept of worse mix. A study done in 2019 found that Facebook was was leading in news consumption over other social media sites, but that overall a full 88% of all those surveyed believed that social media had at least some control over the news that people see. Respondents believed that social media has too much control over the mix of the news we see on their platforms, and more than half said they believe that this results in what we call a worse mix of news. A large proportion identified one-sided news and named inaccurate news as a very big problem on social media. People promoting news through paid advertising can rewrite these news headlines to fit their political agendas. What we choose to click on and the power of algorithms will also control what kind of news we continue to see. If we look at Instagram, we have to realize that when things are being posted, there's no links that can be embedded in the posts so that we can get to original articles. And very rarely do you see someone posting something on Instagram and just copying and pasting the text in for where you might want to go and find out more. Are you following people who don't think like you? That's a limitation. And of course, influencers can skew news. Recent academic studies have shown that perceived message credibility was greater when a fabricated post was endorsed by a trustworthy personality. For instance, US Congress investigations regarding the spread of misinformation and propaganda around the 2016 presidential election revealed that about 20 million Instagram users in the United States were reached by fake accounts generated by Russian sources, of course. Imagine also how powerful the words of social influencers like American supermodel Bella Hadid, who has 51.7 million followers, can be in convincing young people to have anti-Israel and therefore anti-Semitic beliefs based on many statements that she makes about the Israeli-Palestinian situation that are blatantly false. We also get our information from turning on our computer and going into the internet right away. Yahoo, Rogers, Bell provide us with these quick headlines, but that's all they are. They're there to catch your attention and encourage more clicks. Secondary sources using newswire services are just there to gather top stories. They don't give you that in-depth information. And of course, the telecom corporation, whether it be Yahoo, Rogers, Bell, et cetera, will not post news that is negative towards their own company. Although many of our students aren't using the more traditional sources of information, we should be addressing how they deliver information as well. TV, for example, is mainly headline news. Each story is limited to 2 minutes in length. They require some kind of visual content for it to even be included in the news that day. And fewer viewers are there due to there's the fact that there's more channel choice. So the information requires how many people they believe are watching their particular news show. On radio, where some people are still getting information, keep in mind there are no visuals. So we're taking in that information just through auditory means, and that can limit the information we get. Each story, again, if it's going on the news on the radio, is limited to 30 seconds or less. Therefore, how in-depth can it be? And of course, they're caught between public service and making money. So both TV and radio and newspaper, for that matter, when they're providing us with news, one of the limitations is the fact that they are a commercial enterprise for the most part. And so are we getting information based on their commercialism or based on their public service? Newspapers have limitations as well, although they can go more in depth into information. There are political biases inherent in each publication based on who owns them. They need to sell their papers, so therefore that requires sensational headlines. And often there are factual errors in news stories due to the fact that they have to rush to get that next publication out. And sometimes by the time we read that information, that news is already old. We need to also address with our students the fact that we also get news from family, friends, and colleagues. And so if we are getting our information from there, what are the limitations? it's a he said, she said. We don't have those facts to verify, or how many times does somebody tell you something and say, oh, you should go to this internet site and read more about it. Did your friend get the information from many sources to begin with? Are they also only getting that information from one source? And of course, depending on their own biases, we are only going to get information from them based on that. I've put a question mark at the end of the chart because that's where you can open it up to find out from your students, where else are they getting their information? Another framework that I've found useful in talking to secondary students with, and again, I think that you could probably use this at younger grades as well, is how do actual news agencies, the more traditional ones, decide on what is news? And there's basically these 6 reasons that somebody might decide that it's going to make the newspaper that day, or it's going to be on that newscast that night on TV. And the terms that we like to use are the following: timeliness, proximity, consequence, human interest, prominence, and visual content. And to outline what those are, timeliness means it's only going to make the news if that information did just happen. Proximity, it's only going to make the news if it happened close to home. So, for example, if you live in Guelph, Ontario, and you frequent the Stone Road Mall and something happened there, you're going to perk up and be interested in that information because it's close to where you live. Consequence, will it impact the lives of you, the viewer, the reader? If bread prices go up, that's news because it's going to affect our daily lives. Human interest stories are one aspect of what makes the news that day. Can we relate to it on an emotional, humane level? So, of course, we always get that last story at the end of the newscast, such as the firefighter who caught the cat in the tree, right? Something that's going to lighten the load and make us feel human again. Prominence, is it about somebody important or well-known? So if something happened between Lady Gaga and Tony Bennett, we're going to hear about it. But if you and your aunt were performing live somewhere in front of 100 people at a wedding, that doesn't make the news. And of course, visual content. A well-known expression in the media is if it bleeds, it leads, because we are voyeuristic by nature. So they're going to present us with information if it has that accompanying visual content. Another framework that is useful, and you've probably seen it in various forms, but we've chosen to show you this one today, which comes via the University of Toronto Libraries. And that's what we call the CRAP test. And you can, again, you might bring in some piece of information to the class and then have students analyze it based on this test. Its currency, its relevance, its authority, its accuracy, and its purpose. So I know many of you have probably heard of that before, but it's a very useful tool to use, and address the information that students are getting. Triangulation is another important term that's worth talking about with your secondary school students in particular, because they're now at that point where a lot of the homework that they're doing, or a lot of assignments they're doing in many subjects, not just where they're studying media literacy, is the concept of finding information. And so we are teaching them that if you want to get good information, you have to go to more than one place. So we need to talk to them about that with regard to the media as well. Is it used when you look at multiple sources? Are you trying to find a consensus on the facts? And if you're not sure if something's true, then obviously you want to corroborate the information by looking at multiple sources. And that can include traditional media, scientific studies, and library databases. And it's also important that we address the fact that if we are media conscious citizens, we have our own biases about what sources can be considered reliable. For example, Wikipedia, you could have an entire conversation about how reliable that one source is. Yet, if we're talking about triangulation, we want to explain that if it's only one source, then you can still be using it as long as you're using other sources as well. Often, we quickly get information on these social media sites that we might be involved in, whether it's Reddit or Facebook or Instagram or Twitter. How do we know that that quick piece of information that just came to us, again, is true or not? So I like to present to students the fact that there are people out there already who have already started using the internet to fact check some of this information. And these are just a few of the places that you can go to as a teacher before you talk about something in class, but also that you can have your students go to verify information. Because if you see a piece, something that's on the internet, like they say that sounds too good to be true or too bad to be true, then probably somebody else has checked it out. And so there is this organization called Break the Fake. They do a lot of discussion about this. You can follow them on Instagram and Twitter. But one of the organizations that I've used quite often is Snopes.com, the one up in the top right-hand corner. But you can see that there are many now out there: Lead Stories, The Fact Checker, Media Bias Fact Check, Truth or Fiction. All of these are very reputable sites now on the internet where you can plug in information and see what they have found out about it. Finally, we don't just get information in text and in quick verbiage that comes across our social media sites, but images obviously play a large role in how we get information. And so we need to teach students how to fact check even an image. And so again, many of you have probably done this already. And if you haven't, it's a good tool for you as a teacher to use, because you're probably getting images and you need to verify where you're getting those images from to use for certain aspects of your teaching. But also our students need to verify an image. So it's very quick. This little diagram very quickly shows you how you can do this. You go into Google Images and you click on, there's a camera icon that pops up there on your screen. Then you go to the actual image that you're just checking out, and you can right click on it and choose copy image address, and then put that into the bar where it provides you a place to paste the image URL. And then once you click on search for the image, then you can scroll through the results and try to see where that image was first used, and if in fact it is truly what it says it is, or if it was used in a different context, or part of, even possibly part of a satirical piece, or is it old? Was it from something that happened in a whole other event, in a whole other place, at a whole other time? So is this a real photo? Did this really happen? Here's one specific example that you could bring to your students. We can talk about how it can be harmful that stereotypes about people in the LGBTQ community, for example, can be perpetuated. This photo is one that recently circulated in social media, claiming to be a photo of the Luxembourg Prime Minister and his same-sex partner. The photo, just so you know, circulated with false captions hundreds of times on Twitter, Facebook, and Weibo. One Twitter user commented in Chinese, "These are a group of goblins against humanity, and they're roaming Europe." Another one that went along with this image, purporting to be the Luxembourg PM, said, "Luxembourg will be damned soon." However, this photo is actually, can you go back? Sorry, Diana. This photo that you're looking at is actually a photo of a famous Austrian singer and drag queen, Conchita Wurst, and business manager Andre Karsai. The picture was taken at the Vienna Opera Ball on February 28th, 2019. And Conchita is actually the drag queen persona of a person named Thomas Neuwirth. She is best known for winning the European Song Contest in 2014. But of course, if you've not lived in Europe, you've not been conscious of the international drag queen scene, or you haven't been politically aware of European politics, or a fan of Eurovision Song Contests, you could easily fall victim of this disinformation. And hundreds did. This is the real Prime Minister of Luxembourg with his same-sex partner. And the Prime Minister's name of Luxembourg is Xavier Bettel, and this is his partner, Gauthier Destiné. The picture was taken in 2015, and it was taken when Bettel became the first serving EU leader to wed a same-sex partner. But of course, final analysis, anyone with homophobic tendencies could easily perpetuate dramatic tropes about gay couples by using the previous photo to sway public opinion.
Thank you, Nina. Fascinating ideas on how media literacy is serious fun. I'm going to share curriculum developed by Neil and I and field tested with 2 visual art classes. I'm a high school teacher in Toronto, and I also want to mention that this curriculum can be delivered in other subject areas with spin-off activities in terms of creative work, spin-off production activities. And I'll give a couple of suggestions on how to use this curriculum in English or history. So I'll mention that at the end of the presentation. Next slide, please. All the responses to the questions in this series of lessons are student responses. Just to share that with you in case I didn't write student response below. Step 1, lesson 1 begins with a previewing activity on the topic of what does freedom mean to you? This entire unit is on looking at the Ottawa protests that took place for at least a month, the winter of 2022. And so let's just start thinking of that topic, freedom. We hear it many times in our culture, in our media. And so student responses are here, and values that students appreciate and value the most in their life in Canada. You can see a student response below. I won't always read the entire student response. Thank you, Dana. If your freedoms are ever threatened, what are some measures you would take to secure these freedoms? I would peacefully protest or spread awareness on the situation to get more people to talk and so that my freedom would be restored. Has your family ever felt that their freedoms have been threatened? And so the student gave a very personal response. I'm just paraphrasing it. Students shared, we as teachers in the humanities hear stories that are very personal from our students, personal stories of leaving a country that was in a state of civil war, where the students young people were being killed, living as refugees in another country, waiting for a long time for any country to accept them. And those young people are our students. And so media literacy is really important, having students think about these important topics and discuss them in the classroom is powerful. Next slide, please. After that previewing activity, we start to ask students about the event that took place in Ottawa. And first, let's ask them, what do you know about Ottawa? And then the second question here is, what has been happening there? You would, of course, paraphrase this question according to when you use your own version of this curriculum or something similar. A lot of radical protesters were holding the city of Ottawa hostage. And inside Ottawa, a lot of racist incidents have developed. In Windsor, a lot of international trade was blocked and disrupted, which resulted in negativity in the workers' salaries. Next slide, please. I showed the students images from the Ottawa protests I found on the internet. And I live in Toronto. I've been delivering this curriculum here in Toronto. And so we have many sources of information and disinformation. So I provided them with 5 images. Here are 4 of them, and asked them to make some observations on what happened. Next slide, please. And then the strategy I used to have students think about the news on how the news story has been represented in the media was to compare and contrast 2 different versions of the news. One is a Canadian source. It's actually from Ottawa, CTV News. And I know that Michelle is providing you with the link in the chat. And these are 3 basic questions that you see here that I ask each time we look at each version of the news about this event. Whose stories are we hearing in this report? What are these stories, and whose stories are we not hearing in this news report? Now, earlier during the session, we heard Nina, we heard Neil and Chelsea share with us the media literacy triangle with the 3 sections of the triangle: audience, text, and production. I would say those 3 questions are largely from the section on text. And so it's a video clip. It runs about 4 minutes, and I've paraphrased some information from it to just let you see what is this version of the news. The title of this news story is written as such: Living Hell. Officials paint grim picture of fallout from lingering Ottawa protests. We hear a politician's perspective saying that there is harassment, there is terror on the streets, and they're asking the federal RCMP to take over. We hear the perspective from a chief of police, Peter Slowly. He's saying, we're trying our best, but having our CMP take over may not be possible. And of course, we hear the third player in this big event, the Freedom Convoy leaders telling the government, all will be well when you end the mandates. So showing this event as being disruptive to the lives and frightening to the people who live in Ottawa. Now, a second perspective, all published within the same few days, mid-February 2022. This video clip runs for about 8 minutes, and the questions are the same. What is the perspective that we hear about the story? What are the stories? Whose stories are we not hearing? Here are student answers by various students. She is lying. I'm going to actually be reading to you a paraphrase of this 8-minute story in the next slide, and then we may come back to the slide. Thank you, Diana. Okay, let's just read a paraphrase of what the story is about, and then we'll look at the student responses. Next slide, please. Okay. Our neighbors to the north are clearly losing it. The Prime Minister, who needs a history lesson and a haircut, has declared war on Canadian citizens like they are an ISIS caliphate, emergency powers, freezing bank accounts, threatening to take away protesters' dogs and children. It's getting so bad up there, government forces are even threatening innocent gelato shops, like this one here in Ottawa, Canada. The owner of Stella Luna Cafe made a giant mistake. She privately supported the Freedom Truckers Convoy with a $250 donation. Her donation then leaked and was made public. Her gelato shop was then doxxed, and she began receiving threats, lunatics threatening her with violence and vandalism, threatening her like a Salem witch, all because she showed her support for freedom. The owner of Stella Luna Cafe, Tammy Giuliani, no relation to Rudy, is here with us now. What exactly is going on up there with your shop? Well, I should preface by saying I have a tendency to think with my heart and not with my head. And does that get me in trouble? A lot. And would I change that about myself? Not in a million years. And when I heard about a group of people who were willing to drive all the way across the country in below 30 weather to gather peacefully in front of Parliament Hill, and to stand for their beliefs and say maybe this whole mandate and the existence for everyone needs to be revisited, my heart said no. And I don't think I could have imagined that it could have been transformed into what we are witnessing today. Yes, we are witnessing complete chaos. Next slide, please. I don't know how to describe it. You probably know better than I do. What kind of threats and harassment did you face? Asks the Fox News reporter. You need to understand that Stella Luna is our livelihood. My husband and children and my son-in-law all work in the business. That's how we pay our rent. That's how we keep our lights on. That's how we eat. We have a passion. So I reached into my personal pocket and pulled out $250 of my personal money. So I gave a donation to fill a gas tank so someone wouldn't have to sleep in -30 in the cold that night. And I think that decision speaks to my humanity and not to political beliefs. But attacking our children, attacking our team, that's unconscionable. Never in my 56 years have I experienced a country so divided, so full of hatred towards friends and neighbors. They might have opinions that are different from theirs, but They're so willing to publicly shame and spew angry vitriol. We have been called terrorists. We're just a little gelato shop just because I decided to fill a gas tank for somebody so he wouldn't have to sleep on the street at night. We all need a little healthy dose of positivity and love and respect, and we all need a lot less judgment and hate. And I think before people would open their mouths, just listen to their hearts and find humanity. People would be better served. So that's large amount of text from this video, news clip from Fox News. Dana, please go back 2 slides to the student responses. We'll just glance at them. And once more, please. Thank you. And so whose story are we hearing? Whose story? What is the story? And so here's a student response. She was lying. There is evidence in videos that protesters are intimidating store owners and damaging property. They were carrying Nazi flags and Trump flags. Next question states, what did the owner of Stella Luna Gelato Cafe, Tammy Giuliani, do to support the truckers? She gave them a trucker $250 for gas so they wouldn't have to sleep in the cold that night. Next slide, please. And so she claims that we're just a little gelato shop. Is that true? Should we believe this? They might be a little gelato shop, the student says. However, the choices that they made are awful. By donating to the very people who would go all the way to Windsor and stop international trade, which affects the workers negatively since they need money to help themselves and their families in order to survive. In general, why on earth would you support people who are ruining other people's lives? And she continues to say, we just need a little more love. This is an emotional appeal, similar to the other strategies used in news that Nina shared with us. Should we believe her? Is this, and this is the moment where she starts to cry as well. No, we shouldn't believe her. She is just using white tears to help herself and her family while she's being a terrorist and hurting other people. She is a hypocrite. She supports other terrorists. Next slide, please. And next slide, please. And one more. Beautiful. So here, back up. So here I've created a chart just for us to see the 3 significant players in this news story: the Government of Canada. Next slide, please. The protesters and the police, and how each has been represented by each of these news sources. We'll go to the one stating comparing representations of the Government of Canada and perfect. Federal, provincial, municipal. City TV news, we hear a city councillor telling us about the chaos on the streets of Ottawa. People are terrified. There's no peace, and they need enforcement now. Now, Fox News, they represented our Government of Canada by saying our Prime Minister needs a history lesson and a haircut. He's declaring war on Canadian citizens, emergency powers, freezing bank accounts, threatening to take protesters and their dogs and children. Completely different portrayals of the similar and same players in the story. One is Fox News, American, another is Ottawa City News. Next slide, please. And so how have the Freedom Convoy truckers, protesters been represented by each of these points of view? City TV, Ottawa News, is saying that they're telling the government to end all C-19 mandates. They're saying there's a living hell on the streets of Ottawa. They're blaming the politicians who prefer to vilify and call us names rather than engage in respectful, serious dialogue. That is representation of the truckers in from the Ottawa News. Fox News is telling us those protesters are a group of people who are willing to drive all the way across the country in below 30 weather to gather peacefully in front of Parliament to stand up for their beliefs. Completely different version of the story. Thank you. Strong contrast in these two representations from each source. And the police. Ottawa City News tells us that the chief police officer is saying it's not legally possible to bring in the RCMP. He's being cautious in efforts to restore peace, being legal and cautious. Fox News, he prompts the owner of Stella Luna Cafe with this question: what kind of threats and harassment did you face? He's provoking her to blame everyone, including the police. And the police are portrayed as forces that are inflicting threats and harassment towards Stella Luna Cafe, while in fact, we know that it is the protesters who are intimidating store owners and damaging property. Different versions of the same story, different portrayals of the key players in this historic event that we're looking at from these two perspectives. Thank you. And then I provided students with photographs of signs from this protest. Since we are a visual arts class, let's look at the visuals that were on the streets of Ottawa. Upside down flag represents disrespect, messages disrespect to the country. Thank you trucker signs, right-wing terrorists that are against the mandates. Hold the line signs, continue with the terror and chaos, demanding an end to mandates. All student responses. Next slide, please. Here's another image of signage and how it was represented on the streets of Ottawa. The Canadian flag represents our country. The hockey stick indicates that these protesters probably love hockey. They want fairness, just like hockey is a game that has to be played with following the rules and a patriotism to our country. Next slide, please. And then and of course I showed several other images for them to analyze. Now, the next step was for the students to insert and find their own images and make notes on the symbols they see on the streets of Ottawa and what is the message. Yes, there were some profanities that they found referring to our Prime Minister and other signs and symbols from the protest telling us about that chaos. Next slide, please. Another spin-off could be for advanced level class, for them to do some research. There were other protests taking place at the same time in this country and other countries. So here are three choices: Alberta, Windsor, another country. Research that protest also regarding C-19 mandates. Next slide, please. And so write a summary about this news story and make a note and think about what was the protest against. Was it about government oppression, or was it about oppression caused by the COVID-19 virus? Identifying the what questions, the why questions is important. Next slide, please. And so another research, which is fascinating for us, the students to think about, is to think back 1 year earlier, almost exactly 1 year earlier. There was a protest that took place on Capitol Hill, January 8th, 2021. And so what are some of the similarities between the Freedom Convoy protests in Ottawa to the protest that took place in 2021 on Washington's Capitol Hill? Similarities: protesters were right-wing extremists in both cases. Similarities: there was vandalism, there was theft. Differences: no one entered Parliament Hill in Canada, Ottawa, Ontario, whereas in in Washington, D.C., many protesters entered and vandalized the White House. This link is just from Wikipedia to provide information if your students need some background knowledge to do a little research. Next slide, please. Thank you. And so, final reflections. By learning these multiple perspectives about the Freedom Convoy protests in Ottawa, Ontario, we can say that each perspective contains some truths and some lies. Thank you, Diana, for that prompt earlier on this afternoon. Whose perspective shall we believe? Do the stories that you read in this assignment tell the truth? That you read in this assignment tell the truth? What is the truckers' truth? What is the truth of the federal government of Canada? On the next slide, you'll see these answers again. Next slide, please. The truckers kept claiming that their freedom to work and provide for themselves and their families was being taken away. They started to protest to take back their freedom. The federal government has been making mandates and regulations with the intentions of protecting Canadians and decreasing the number of COVID cases and deaths. Thank you, Diana. Next slide, please. And here is a final sort of summary from a student, grade 11 visual art, who is giving a response on not only was it about COVID-19 mandates, but racism was taking place in this country. In all honesty, and it continues to take place. In all honesty, everything that has just happened in Ottawa is a perfect example of the hypocrisy within this country and in the West. These protests have been going on for a while, and only until things have gone so far do they bring the police and take extreme measures for these right-wing protests that aren't even peaceful protests, just riots and raids over not following simple rules that were made to protect the citizens of this country. When it comes to other protests in this country, like the BLM, the missing Indigenous women protests, etc., they always bring the police and extreme measures right away when majority of the time these protests are peaceful. Ethnic minorities have been threatened as second-class citizens for so long up until this day, while right-wing white people are treated like queens and kings that own the place. Even Premier Doug Ford has defended these right-wing protesters numerous times on television, claiming that most of them are peaceful when that's not the case. And you can just hear the voice of a teenager speaking as we listen. And thank you. And so now I took them to look at protest art. We're a visual art course, and I've been telling people the history of printmaking is really also the history of protest art. I showed students but 11 different artists who are printmakers, whose art is powerful in communicating messages of hope in turmoil and during times of war. The images that I shared with the students came from this book titled Paper Politics, Socially Engaged Printmaking Today, 2009. Thank you. Next slide, please. Before I showed the images of art, of course, I showed them a few more posters, but this time the questions were about the image, the text, and the techniques by which this poster is being made. Notice the imagery, the hand clenching the needle, the vaccine needle. It was got the viruses caught in there. Next slide, please. Here's another poster, handmade, different technique, different handmade technique. What's the imagery? What's the text? What techniques were used to make this protest poster? Thank you, Diana. Next slide, please. And we did see some fascinating alternations of the Canadian flag in Ottawa, alternative versions of the Canadian flag. Here we have a promotion and respect for our LGBTQ communities. So imagery, text, techniques. Next slide, please. Here is the first artist I showed the students. Name of the artist is Josh McPhee. With each artist, I showed them 3 different artworks, and I asked them to select one of these artworks to comment on. Next slide, please. And the questions were, what imagery and symbols do you see in this artwork? Describe these symbols, elaborate on how they've been represented, and then what is the possible meaning of these images and symbols? Next slide, please. Of course, we had to look at Kathy Kolowitz and her work at the end of the First World War, the mothers. Next slide, please. War and compassion, process politics were the 3 choices. And next slide, please. Same questions. What imagery do you see? What describe these images? Not only name them now, describe them, and then what is the message? What's the meaning? They were to write about one of those 3 artworks. Sue Koh's work, as you can see, is quite contemporary and appealing to our students, representing their world and the things we should all care about. Next slide, please. Tweeter in Chief is the title of this one. Powerful work by Sue Koh. And next slide, please. Haiti, they selected one and they made notes on imagery, description of the symbol of the image, and then the possible meaning. Next slide, please. Many of the students actually really loved this work by Dusty Herbig. Here are 2 images by Dusty Herbig. Next slide, please. Another one. And I'm sure you're starting to notice that the image of the hand, the human hand, is being used quite interestingly, quite powerfully in all of these protest artworks, or many of these protest artworks. Name and list the images, the meaning, and then describe it, then what does it mean? Thank you. So Meek, next slide, please. And 2 more works by Meek, each slightly different techniques and but important messages. Same question, choose one. And so what is the imagery in the work? Describe it? How is it being portrayed, represented? What does it mean? What's the possible meaning? And I'm sure you were thinking, what about Banksy? Yes, I showed them Banksy and they had a wonderful conversation about looking at these works by Banksy. Next slide, please. They were to choose one. Next slide, please. Same questions. Choose one work by Banksy and imagery, description of imagery, possible meaning. Thank you. Next slide, please. It was a wonderful moment to say, hey, let's draw our hands, since we had looked at so many different representations of hands by these protest artists. Blind contour drawing of hands are fascinating, but contour line drawings of hands are wonderful as well. And so that was a great sketchbook homework assignment. Next slide, please. And I'm just giving you a few more, or the same images you've just seen, where the hand is featured in these protest artworks. Thank you, Diana. Okay, here is a production activity, a creative work activity where the students are tasked to use an app. They can choose which app to work with, use their cell phone, a tablet, or a computer. And I said to them, let's take photographs of our hands and manipulate that image to communicate a message that you care about. Next slide, please. Take that photograph, manipulate it using various tools. The goal is to come up with designs that you could use possibly for your reduction printmaking project. Keep that, but always keep your message in mind and play. And so these are student examples. Here are 2. Next slide, please. Thanks, Dana. And here are another 2. And you may say, which app did they use? They happen to use Photo Director in these examples, but it's very important to check with your school librarians to see which apps are authorized by your school board, which ones allow us to maintain our privacy as we use them. There was another prompt that I came up with, and thank you all along to my friend Neil. He shared with me a wonderful link, but before I show it to you, I'm going to tell you the review. Lesson 3, Step 1, Signs of Hope. Our study about the COVID-19 protests in Ottawa and the city of Ottawa that took place recently reminded us that we see many versions of the truth in our media culture. Whose truth should we believe? Whose definition of freedom should we believe? Following this lesson, we looked at 11 artists throughout history who have made art to give people a sense of hope in times of war. Let's use this art as inspiration for our creative printmaking project. Next slide, please. And so, yes, you can ask them to choose a mentor. Notice the symbols that that mentor uses in their work and what might the meaning of the symbols be. This will be a cyclical process. They may want to start drawing and then go back and select a mentor. But these are all useful techniques to have students start to create. Next slide, please. And prompt them by always having them consider, what do you want to say? What is your message? And it doesn't have to be pretty, but it should be a message of hope. You don't have to have pretty, like happy imagery. Tell the truth, speak about what you care about, and give a message of hope. What are you hoping for in your future? What are you hoping for in our world? What are you hoping for your family and friends? What are your values? And this is where I gave them that news clip that Neil shared with me. It is a story about a woman in Winnipeg, Manitoba, who came up with an idea to honor Ukraine. Many of her family members are from Ukraine. And so she said, and winter has been long in Manitoba. And so she said, let me create some stencils of the sunflower design, because the sunflowers are the national flower of Ukraine, and let me spray paint through my stencils using plastic plates, and this will be a symbol of hope for the people of Ukraine. And so looking at that artwork, they did the analysis. And now is the prompt where they think about what they want to say, what they want to create. What do you want to say? What's your message? What symbols will you use? This is the chart. Now, they may say, hey, I just need to draw. And so that is perfectly fine. Give them a piece of paper and say, great, go ahead and draw. And then they can come back and make notes on their symbols. Next slide, please. And so these are notes by a particular student. I'll start sharing them with you, and then you'll see the student's drawings, then you'll see more notes. The student is telling us her topic, it happens to be a female, is racism in Western countries. She's starting with the symbol of the Confederate flag as a prominent part of her design. She's saying the Confederate flag represents institutional and overt racism that has been happening in Western countries such as ours. Next slide, please. She also has image of Black person's hands in handcuffs. Also, same topic, racism in Western countries. The Black hands in the handcuffs represent that Black people are being targeted and they're being the victims of police brutality. Next slide, please. And here you see the outline drawing. It had to be a shaped design because it's going to be carved out of linoleum, and then 3-4 color maximum on the tracing paper by which they transfer the design onto the linoleum. So this is the design she's discussing. And so she's told us about the Confederate flag, that the hands of a person of color, and she's going to tell us about the handcuffs and the drops of blood. Next slide, please. Drops of blood. The blood drops represent all the blood shed by Black people and the fact that the American and Canadian government has blood on their hands for for condoning the murder of Black people by police. Next slide, please. And the tear on the flag. I'm not sure if you noticed there's a tear. The tear on the flag represents how the justice system is corrupt and unjust and racist. It represents how the system was never broken, but created with the intention to serve the majority, AKA white people, and how it divides the majority and ethnic minorities by treating ethnic minorities as second-class citizens. Next slide, please. And so they may need to draw first and then write. They may need to write first and then draw. Whatever the process your students need, each student will have a different approach to doing the creative work. Next slide, please. And of course, we all have hybrid classes. And so for my virtual students, I'm sending them soft cut. Their sizes are a little bit smaller, and they will be transforming that design onto soft cut. Also, a reduction block print can be made with soft cut. Next slide, please. Before we carve the soft cut or the linoleum, we're working expressively. It's a very expressive printmaking technique where I gave them a piece of installation styrofoam used to build houses and a big fat nail, a big fork, and they made impressions, symbols that they cared about, symbols they were prompted to use by looking at the protest art. And so this is a two-step printing process. They made impressions, they made prints on black or manila paper, and then they made 8-10 prints, and then they made a second set of impressions on that styrofoam block, and then they rolled ink again, or we used acrylic paint actually, and then they printed again. And I asked them to think about color and contrast, but subtle effects are powerful as well. Next slide, please. Here's the styrofoam block. It's been carved twice. And the prints you see here on manila and also on black cardstock have been printed twice. Next slide, please. And one more example, the styrofoam block. The white on black was printed once. The purple on manila below was printed once. The image to the right, top right, was printed twice with some rainbow effects and how they inked the block. Reminders of how to come up with ideas, just a list of topics to think about. These are topics our students care about and think about a lot nowadays. Next slide, please. Steps on creating the creative work. I didn't give you a long list of how to do a reduction block print, but that technique can be researched. Next slide, please. And so here's a spin-off activity, possibly for an English classroom or a history classroom. Look at different versions of the Canadian flag in our media today. Look at representations of the Ukrainian flag in our media today. Look at different representations of the Confederate flag in our media. And how would you transform either or any of these flags to possibly be more inclusive, to symbolize peace, to condone oppression against ethnic minorities? And those students in other classrooms could draw and collage. Collage is a wonderful technique that is very accessible, also works beautifully with virtual students. Thank you. And again, thank you to Neil for your support and all your wonderful ideas and prompts and learning.
Very welcome. We hope that you've enjoyed this webinar. We especially hope that you've seen ideas that you can use effectively to help your students develop their media literacy. We also teach an additional qualifications course in media studies, which you can find on our website. Thank you to all the exciting and knowledgeable teachers who have shared their ideas today, and thank you for attending. Next slide, please. The AML website has many more fun learning ideas. Next slide, please. We also invite you to listen to our Mediacy podcast on Voice Ed Radio. Next slide, please. We are also on Instagram and Twitter. And now, Peter, we are going to turn it back to you. Thank you very much for being our moderator.
Thanks so much. I'll just take over the screen again. Thank you so much. This was very interesting and very timely. Actually, it's been very timely for like the last 6 years, right? Anyway, just a reminder to everyone, you'll be receiving an email tomorrow with a link to the evaluation form. And actually, I will pop that link in the chat right now, so you don't actually have to wait for the email. And now this slide actually says you'll receive a link to the slide deck, but that won't be true. You will receive show notes, which will have a link to the website. And then as they indicated at the beginning, the slides will be posted there in a few weeks. Also, you'll receive a link to the video. So it'll be posted on the OTF YouTube channel, which there's the link for that there. So I'll pop that in as well. And I would encourage you to pop over to the YouTube channel and have a look at the other videos that have been posted from this webinar series. I also want to profile one other OTF feature that many teachers aren't aware of. It's the OTF PD Calendar. So if you're thinking about taking an AQ or an ABQ, this is sort of your one-stop shop. You can go there, and what we attempt to do is catalog all the qualification courses from all the different faculties and the unions, and have them all there. So you can just pull up a discipline. You can pull up, the month that you want to take the course, and you'll be able to search for it there. And that would be it for me. Our next webinar. So this is actually the last of this series of 14 webinars, the spring series. We hope to be back in August. So hopefully you're a subscriber to the OTF mail list and watch your emails.